When you're doing product development and branding, you have to base your insights and decisions on facts. And one of the best ways to find facts is through secondary data or other people's information. I like to think of secondary data along a continuum. Think of a caterpillar, then a chrysalis, and then a butterfly. Each stage becoming more and more advanced. In the caterpillar phase, there are a couple of steps. In the caterpillar phase, there are 3 steps. First, library research or online research. What you're doing is going and basically citing or reviewing other people's work, summaries, opinions, write-ups, articles, research studies. These are all things that are out there and already formatted and packaged in a way that you can rely on them for your conclusions. While this is really important, and you might look at several articles and develop your own trends, there's really not that much sophistication behind it. It's usually using secondary research on the most basic level. The next type of secondary research under the caterpillar phase is something I call databases or published information. These are things that are tracked in there and somebody's collecting this information, and so you have an opportunity to either go in there and look at the summaries they've made of that information, or better yet, do your own queries. Find out how many people said this, or how often a topic came up, or what the issue was. There are all sorts of opportunities you have to do more work with that secondary data that's already existing in a database form. And then the third category is something I would call scientific papers or articles or trade journals. These are written by experts that are maybe more focused than your general library research or your general Google searches. They would be experts within a particular field that had some sort of insights. And so you can see from these 3 sources, that's valuable information. You can learn some things, you can get some insights, but what you're doing beyond that may be a little bit limited. That's why we call it the caterpillar. You're not moving around that quickly. You're just kind of hanging out. Next on my model, I move to the chrysalis phase, and this is where you're doing trend research. So you're looking at several of these sources and trying to figure out what's happening, what's in common, where do we go with them, how do we package it. So it's a little bit more advanced. You take that basic information and you're trying to organize it in some way and draw a conclusion from it. Then the last phase is something I would call advanced trend analysis, or this is where you really start to become what I'd say is a butterfly. You're moving around, you're getting some great insights, you're kind of going in new directions that and going there more quickly than just milling around as a caterpillar or in a chrysalis phase state as some of the other ones. Some of the examples in here are things like social listening, where you might go to a social media site and read all the comments and evaluate them and group them into categories, some sort of content analysis. That would be a way to see generally, are people saying positive things about you or negative things, and what sorts of themes are coming up with it. Of course, the second category could be correlations, statistics, counts. You could see how often something is said or how many times people talk about it. This is all based on the idea that the intensity or the frequency in which someone speaks about something is usually an indication of how important it is. And then finally, where you really get to going is when you start taking secondary data and you basically create a new data file of your own that you can do some sort of analysis or some sort of investigation in. Now, I know these are kind of theoretical at this point, and so I want to give you a lot of examples that show different levels of how we've been able to go through and use this secondary data to create something new and valuable and insightful that wasn't sitting out there by itself. And so that's really the idea we're going for. Avonworth Community Park is a park that's in the city of Pittsburgh here, out in one of the suburbs down the Ohio River, and it's actually managed or operated by 5 separate municipalities, and they formed an authority. An authority is a government agency that is allowed to operate, charge money, so on and so forth. And so you have like water authorities or sewerage authorities, these sorts of authorities. Well, this is an authority that runs this particular park. And it's funded by these 5 municipalities. And it was always funded based on census population. The U.S. Census is conducted every 10 years by law, and that's where they try to count everybody in the United States. And so the question was, when the park was being thought about and reorganized a little bit and upgraded, was some of the neighborhoods had changed quite a bit, and some of the people that were representing the different municipalities thought that they had more power and more insight and should have more influence and say over what happened to the park than the other municipalities. And so the question came up that says, well, who's contributed the most to this particular park? What a great question. How did we answer that? At the Carnegie Library in Oakland, they have a place called the Pennsylvania Room. And in the Pennsylvania Room are all of the census, which are the counts of people from different years in Allegheny County, which is the county in which Pittsburgh is located. And so what we did was went and found the books for each of these 5 municipalities and wrote down what the census was, because the park was started in the 1960s and it was going on through to present day. All of a sudden, some of the people, for example, there's one organization or municipality called Ohio Township that's very big now, has a lot of new housing developments and all of that. It was farmland when they started. But if we look at the aggregate of how much they have contributed to the park based on the population, the assessments based on the population, it's pretty average compared to other municipalities. And so what we're seeing is that even though they may be the biggest now, over the lifetime of this agreement, they were right in the middle. And so we see a lot of examples of how you can use secondary data, example this one, the census data, historical, to find out and answer a question as complicated as who's contributed what over time. A second example is from a company called Ships. And what they do is they manage benefits and operate those for big organizations. One of their clients is the federal government. And they wanted to know what are the largest areas of the federal government so that they could start in those divisions. And so one day I got a call from a client of mine, and he's on the phone. He says, Lloyd, and he's whispering. I said, Jim, why are you whispering to me? He says, I'm out in the hallway in Washington, D.C., and we're trying to figure this out. Can you find out what are the biggest agencies within the federal government? And so I did a quick Google search, and I wasn't sure. And so anyway, I called my wife, who's a librarian, and I said, how would I find this? And she says, 412-624, I forget the last 4 numbers. And I said, what's that? She said, that's the desk of the Ready Reference at the Carnegie Library. There are librarians waiting for your call, waiting to help you. So I called the number, told them what we were looking for. A very nice librarian said, hey, give me a few minutes and I'll send you the information. I'm like, great. So about 15 minutes later, we got the information, and we also had a note that said that was from a couple years ago. The most recent one was in the downtown library, which is just a couple blocks from my offices downtown. And so I gave one of my staff members a quarter. I went over, or told them, go over, they've got the book waiting for you, copy the page and bring it back. We got the page, made it all nice, copied it, sent it up to the client, and then I sent him a $500 invoice. He was happy about it, I was happy about it. So you can even get paid for doing secondary research. But the whole point was to use the librarian to help figure out what this particular insight was. And so we were able to quickly find those with the right type of help and the right indexes. In terms of the social listening or going to social media sites and trying to summarize what people are saying, there are companies that do this for you. You can hire a service. I've had friends that have worked in this type of industry where they've tracked the reputation, articles, summations, doing database searches every day, quick reads, quick summaries, giving a package to the executives. You could do it that way, or you could do it on your own. Read some of these comments and put them into groups or categories. Here's an example of a bull rider and all of the people and what they're saying about that. So every video will have comments. Some of the more sophisticated ones will have even deeper comments. There are whole studies that look at campaigns, political campaigns, types of advertisements, donations, all of this sort of thing, and they've taken the time to read all of those comments and then go through and classify them into groups and then do an analysis from there. So that's a very powerful way, instead of just here's a few things that are somebody are saying, to really go through and summarize, are those really mean, nasty comments? Are there a lot of them, or is it just one or two people saying that? What's really happening there? What do you do if you have a bunch of competitors? How do you know if you're standing out, if you're different? Well, one thing you can do is round up all of their media and get a printout or a video or an organization of it, get it in a room and get it organized. Here's an example from a company called Allpack. Allpack makes bottles, supplies, for all different types of products, and so their concept is to sell the bottle. And there's a lot of competitors in this particular space. So what we ended up doing was going and getting all their literature, reviewing their websites and so forth, and through the content analysis found some things like solutions provider of solutions. Everybody was saying the same thing. So not only were their products all looking like bottles and the images and so on and so forth, but all of the wording in the website was almost essentially the same. So how did Allpack stand out? What they decided to do was instead become a consulting company, take a consulting company approach. And so a client would come in, and what they do is design a customized bottle for that client so that client could stand out. Think of something like Dean's milk jugs, or anything that's not a regular Pepsi can or a Pepsi bottle. Those are all pretty standard. But even like Evian, the water bottle, it's got the little peaks on the side of the water bottle. These are all things from a molded plastics or an injection molding standpoint they've made that make that product stand out. Well, that's what this company would do. They'd make a customized mold. And then who did you have to buy the products from? The company that made the mold. Allpack was later sold to a company called Berlin, and they did very well and were able to really start standing out and getting some great traction because of really trying to understand what everybody else was saying by looking at what their literature and their websites and everything was talking about. Sometimes you can learn a lot from a company or about an idea based on how often it's talked about. Here's an example of searching for two words, heaven and hell, in the New Testament, which are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the writers of the Gospels in Christianity. And so what did you think? If you look at this here, who talks about heaven the most? Well, in terms of percentage of time, you can see this, that Matthew talks about heaven 74 different times. That word comes up, all the way down to John, who speaks about it 18 times. What about hell? Who talks about that the most? First of all, it's not talked about as much. You see it's only 7 times in Matthew's, but none in John's gospel. Why? You heard John, or you may have heard this phrase, he wrote the gospel of love. So he didn't talk about hell, at least from the word search terminology. Now, some theologians might disagree and so on and so forth. I'm talking a quick word search. This is what you're able to produce. You could do the same sort of thing if you had your own database. How often are things talked about? and that gives you a little bit of insight and takes that secondary data up just a little bit. Another way to look at words is based on themes or topics that they're talking about. And so there are all these great databases that you have access to through libraries. And for example, in this one, there's a company that makes banking software called Fiserv. And what they do is, the plan was, why don't we search different key banking terms and look for 3 major banks that are pretty much the leaders in their area and what they're doing. And so this would have generated thousands of articles, from little speeches at a little local, Kiwanis Club or something that somebody gave and posted or talked about, on up to articles in newspapers or magazines about trends and so forth. Then what would happen is a group read these particular articles, and then we classified them into themes. And what you can see from this example is that the organizations are really starting to see that some banks have a strategy where some are growing in some areas, others are trying to go to kiosk, some want standalone branches, all sorts of things are changing. And so you can got to get a sense of where the big players are going. Fiserv is able to use this information and then go back and start to develop software and products and solutions that are likely to serve these particular markets. Again, it's all stuff that's public record out there in the world that people are talking about, but you've just thought about it and organized it in a little bit more sophisticated way so that you can make some insights about it. Of course, census.gov, which is a website that has all of those statistics from the census that's conducted every 10 years, plus the little surveys they run in all of these other markets to get estimates, is an excellent place to find data. You can go in there and look by zip code, for example, how many people or what ages, what genders are they, what's their socioeconomic makeup, and so forth. And so of course you could pull those areas out either by municipality or zip code or county, however you wanted to pull them out, and you can basically make a target so that you can say, hey, within this market, here's who we're going after, here's how big it is, here's what's happening, so on and so forth. So it's a great way to use that. So if you've never messed around with census.gov, go there and take a look at it. It's a very powerful database, and if you're a US citizen and you pay taxes, then you're paying for this and you should start using it. Some of the census data is already organized into 2 broad categories called MSAs and DMAs. So an MSA is a metropolitan service area. And if you could imagine, if you're in your car and you're listening to an FM radio, when you're close to the station or the antenna, you can hear it, but as you drive further away, you start to lose reception. That's about the area of an MSA. And here's an example from Pittsburgh. You see the blue area is the MSA. And so those are the counties that are around a county called Allegheny, which is where the city of Pittsburgh is located. And they'll have all of the statistics broken up and classified based on all of these MSAs for all of the major cities throughout the United States, and even territories and other places as well. And so what will happen is companies will say, we want to do a launch in the top 25 MSAs. Well, they will know all of the cities and what's going on and so on and so forth. So it's a way to kind of simplify the information about a marketing launch. DMA is called designated marketing areas. So it's all the MSA plus the other orange counties that are in here. So you can see it goes up further and down into a couple other states. And so that's a broader area, but the same sort of concept that says in that area there's so many people and so much can be reached and so on and so forth based on the classifications. So those are set up for you, and there's a lot of those that you can use in secondary data. You can also combine census data with your own survey data if you ask similar questions with the same categories in your survey. Here's an example from Carnegie Museums, which have museums in the Pittsburgh area. And what they did was they had visitor surveys and they tracked a number of questions, how satisfied people were with their visits and so forth, as well as demographics. Then what they would do is look at the demographics compared to the census estimates. And one of the things they found was that minority communities, in this case African Americans, were not coming to the museum as much as there was in terms of population. They should be getting a bigger draw. So what this was all used for was to develop a program to actually reduce the cost of admissions. At the time, it was about $25 per ticket. So a family of four, it cost $100 to go to the museum, which was pretty expensive. If you had an access card, and an access card is what you use to get your food stamps or special services if you have a child that needs great medical care, or if you're lower income and you need assistance of some kind, they have this access card. And the idea was, if you present your access card, you can get 4 tickets for $1 each. So $4 to get in versus the other 96 you would have had to pay plus the 4 for $100. And so when they rolled this out, it was very, very successful program. It took from their estimates of a few thousand to tens of thousands of visitors that were from minority communities tracked through this access card. How do they pay for it? Foundations, which are organizations where people have donated money and they want to support nonprofit groups like the museums, one of the things they say is they're very interested in serving minority or underserved communities. They don't found that you don't need a bunch of money and programming for people who are successful and living in nice homes and so forth. It tends to be focused more for those that need assistance or opportunities that they don't have. And so what they were able to do is go back to the foundations and say, hey, we're getting ready to run this program. And so the foundations would sponsor to the tune of several $100,000 a year to help offset the cost of that. So even though they were adding a discount to get in, they still had revenue streams because they could prove that they were serving these smaller or more minority type individuals. I had a client ask me one time, what are the top 10 foods that people eat? I'm like, I don't know. We went and of course started doing a little online research and quickly found that every chef and restaurant and food manufacturer has their list. But is there anything scientific? I was trying to figure out, how would we do that? That would be a massive, very expensive survey. And one of my staff members in their research found that the USDA, United States Food and Drug Administration, Department of Agriculture, U.S. Department of Agriculture, had commissioned a study of 20,000 people, 20,000. They recorded a food diary for 1 week. They wrote down everything they ate, everything they put in their mouth, from salt and pepper to whatever food, and it was very detailed. And there was a big study that was published. And the note in this little review or article that my staff member read was for $100 or whatever it was at the time, you could get the information. And so, of course, we paid for that. We got the information. At this time, it came on a disc, and we couldn't figure out what to do or how to use it or whatever. And so I said, why don't you call back to the department, find out who put that study together, who put the disc together. We did that. And I had a very nice and long conversation with the author of the study, and they basically told us how to do the database search and so on and so forth. And so if you can imagine, there were millions of food records in there. But what did we figure out? What are the top 10 foods? It might be exactly like you think: chicken and French fries and hamburger. But we were able to do that with a very defensible secondary source by searching that information once we got a hold of the database. But it was much more cost effective than trying to go out and run our own study to answer this client's questions. One last example here is from a database. I had a client ask, in the banking industry, is there any way to use the information that's required to be reported for marketing purposes? So you may or may not be aware of this, but every financial institution is required to report about 250 variables. How many assets they have, what their profitability is, how many accounts they have, so on and so forth, down to the branch level. And what we did in this particular case was say, well, here's the database of all of the banks at the time that are out there in the United States, and we know which ones are our clients, so could we take some of these variables and see how well they're doing? And so we were able to find the data for our clients, subtract it from the total database, and those would be the non-clients. And long story short, through this analysis, we're able to quickly find that the software the clients were using was obviously more successful. These banks were doing much better financially than the banks that weren't using the software. Well, it didn't take them very long to put that into financial terms and literature and so forth. That same database, we've also used that for going out and figuring out how many deposits are within a local branch. And so you're in a little town or a little community and you've got a bank, you've got other big banks. Well, what percentage of the market share do you have? And if we look at that, are we able to say, hey, we got a lot of growth because we're only 3% or 5% of the market. The other place has, there's 2 or 3 other big banks in there. Or are we already 90% of that market and there's really no more to grow? So this is a way where, because of reporting requirements for the FDIC, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, then you can go in there, everybody has access to that database, and you kind of backwards build the health of those particular organizations or those particular banks or branches. And so these are several examples of how you can be the butterfly. Be the butterfly. Instead of just saying, well, here's an article I found and searching or reporting that, or that's all fine. But when you take it to the other end of the spectrum, where you're actually taking data and you're putting it in a file and you're at least looking at trends or maybe making a more sophisticated file to do an analysis, then it really gets exciting and you're coming up with firsthand insights and observations that many clients and many organizations will find very, very helpful. That's going to be great when you think about your product development and your branding and convincing others, if it's not you, that have the money to spend it in developing those products and branding them and communicating and marketing them. So it's a great tool to use.